I woke up to the same dull noise that had been my companion for months. The station always sounded like that. Equipment running day and night, air filters wheezing, the occasional metallic creak from stress fractures nobody cared about. This wasn't a pristine lab with spotless white walls and state-of-the-art instruments. The station was old, functional, built for durability and not much else. I'd been alone here for 182 days, 4 hours, and 33 minutes. I only knew that because the station liked to remind me every morning. I pushed off the sleep module. My legs slowed to respond in the low gravity. My muscles felt stiff. I reached for the suit hanging on the wall next to my bunk, routine. Every day, I checked the systems, repaired what needed repairing, and kept the place from falling apart. Pulling the suit over my legs, I felt the tug of the rubberized material clinging to my skin, trapping the sweat against me before I even started moving. The inner lining always stuck to me, a second layer of damp, confining fabric. But this was the job. Sweat and discomfort were part of the package. I sealed the suit up to my neck, then checked the oxygen feed. The station had plenty of supplies, enough to last me another 6 months. But I didn't trust the tanks any more than I trusted the wiring that buzzed sporadically when the lights faltered. I clipped on the helmet, heard the soft hiss of the air filter engage, and took a long, steady breath. First check, pressure seals. I moved toward the main control panel in the center of the cabin, floating slightly in the low gravity. Every movement was precise, because one misstep could send me crashing into the walls. The control panel was old enough that I had to check everything manually because the automatic diagnostics had failed about 3 months ago. Never fixed that. No point. It wasn't like anyone was going to inspect the station. I was alone, and nobody cared what went on out here as long as I didn't screw up too badly. The panel lit up, screens blinking in a sequence of green and yellow. No reds. That was a good sign. I skimmed the readings. Pressure stable, oxygen within acceptable range, temperature consistent. The usual numbers flashed by, nothing to worry about. But it still didn't sit right with me. It never did. The station wasn't the kind of place you got comfortable in. It was like wearing a pair of old shoes that never quite fit right. Sure, you could walk in them, but after a few miles, they'd start pinching in places you didn't expect. The station pinched me everywhere. I floated to the back of the cabin where the oxygen filters were housed. The unit was bulky, a relic of earlier designs that were known for being clunky but reliable. I opened the hatch to check the gauges. Routine. Everything was routine. The gauge needles were steady in the green zone, and the faint hiss of airflow was just loud enough to hear. Still, I lingered a bit longer than necessary, listening. It wasn't the kind of noise you noticed until it stopped, and then it was too late. The comms unit crackled in the corner, another useless feature. The comms were dead, and they had been for weeks. That had bothered me for the first few days, but after a while I got used to it. Nobody on the other end to hear me anyway. Floating back toward the center of the cabin, I made a quick sweep of the tools, checking each one by habit. Wrench, torque driver, patch kits, all the things I needed to keep this place together. The station had a way of feeling like it was in constant decay, like the walls themselves were trying to give up. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not on my watch. As I moved past the viewport, I caught a glimpse of the dark beyond. The moon the station orbited wasn't much to look at, just an icy ball hanging in the blackness. No atmosphere, no life, just rock and frozen nitrogen. Beyond that, space stretched out in every direction. A reminder that there wasn't much keeping me alive besides a few inches of reinforced steel. I rubbed my eyes through the visor. The past few nights hadn't been great. Sleep didn't come easy when your brain was trained to listen for the smallest signs of failure. A pressure leak, a malfunction in the air scrubbers, a drop in temperature. I didn't have the luxury of relaxing, not out here. One mistake, and I'd be dead before I even knew what hit me. There was a slight pressure fluctuation on one of the readouts. I frowned and leaned closer to the panel. The number had shifted by a fraction. I tapped the screen, and it steadied itself. Nothing serious, probably just a sensor acting up. Still, it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I muttered under my breath, cursing the station's outdated systems. A part of me wanted to get on with the rest of my routine, but the other part couldn't shake the unease creeping in. There was always something wrong in this place, and it was always subtle. Little things added up, and then they exploded into big problems. I floated back to the pressure control panel, checking the readings again. Everything looked fine, green across the board, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I unclipped a handheld pressure sensor from my belt and moved toward the airlock. The sensor beeped quietly as I passed the bulkhead leading to the storage compartments. I stopped, glanced at the readout. There it was again, that tiny drop in pressure. It was small, sure, but it was there. And in space, small problems didn't stay small for long. I tapped the control panel, adjusting the pressure valve manually. The system hissed as it compensated, bringing the pressure back to nominal levels. But now I was wide awake, my brain working through every possible scenario. Pressure leaks were manageable if you caught them early. If not, well, you didn't have time to worry about it. I floated back toward the tools, grabbed a pressure patch kit, and started making my way down the corridor toward the storage section. The station's walls groaned faintly, the sound of metal settling. That noise had always been there, but today it felt heavier, like the station was straining against something I couldn't see. I reached the storage section and keyed the access panel. The door slid open with a mechanical whir, and I stepped inside, my boots magnetizing to the floor. It was colder here, the temperature regulators not working as well in this part of the station. I could feel it through the suit, a faint chill that prickled at my skin. The pressure sensor beeped again. There was definitely a leak. I exhaled slowly, checking my oxygen levels out of habit. The numbers were fine, but that didn't mean much. If the station was leaking, I'd have a lot more to worry about than my suit's O2 reserves. I unclipped the torch from my belt and started toward the back wall, the source of the problem. I moved toward the back of the storage section. Each step a clumsy shuffle with the magnetized boots holding me to the floor. The space around me was cluttered, filled with sealed crates and spare equipment. Tools floated in place inside mesh nets along the walls, swaying slightly from the station's vibrations. The chill in the air was more pronounced here, and I felt the suit tightening around me, reacting to the temperature drop. I held up the handheld pressure sensor, eyes fixed on the readout. The numbers on the screen were dropping, slowly but steadily. Not a full-blown breach, not yet, but enough to raise alarms in my head. "Come on, you piece of junk," I muttered, running the sensor along the walls, listening for the telltale hiss of escaping air. The silence was unnerving. It meant the leak was small, hidden, and that was bad news. Small leaks were harder to find, harder to patch. They could spread before you even knew what hit you. The sensor beeped, and I stopped, holding my breath. The readout showed a slight spike in pressure loss right where I stood. I scanned the area with the flashlight attached to my helmet. The beam caught on a glimmer near one of the bulkheads. I crouched down, ignoring the creak in my knees. There, along the seam of the wall panel, was a thin line of frost. It stretched out in an uneven pattern, branching like the cracks on a frozen lake. I reached out and ran my gloved finger over it. Way too cold for this part of the station. The pressure sensor beeped again, and I clenched my jaw. The frost meant one thing: a breach in the outer hull. Small, but enough to let the void of space start seeping in. I glanced at the patch kit hanging from my belt, already calculating my next steps. This was manageable if I acted fast. I had to seal it now before it got worse. I grabbed the patch kit and ripped it open, spilling its contents onto the floor. Adhesive patches, a tube of sealant gel, a pair of heat strips. My hands worked automatically, peeling off the backing of a patch. I pressed it against the frosted seam, pushing down to form a tight seal. The patch hissed as the adhesive bonded with the metal, a reassuring sound that almost made me believe this would be an easy fix. I waited, watching the pressure sensor. The numbers stabilized, hovering just below normal. Not perfect, but it would hold for now. I let out a breath, my body relaxing slightly. One problem down, a dozen more to go. I'd have to keep an eye on this spot, run a full diagnostic on the entire section later. The whole station was probably riddled with micro-fractures like this, and it was only a matter of time before another one surfaced. But as I stood up, something caught my eye. A dark smudge on the wall next to the frost line. I shined my flashlight on it, leaning closer. The smudge was a burn mark, thin and irregular, like someone had taken a welding torch and dragged it along the metal. "Damn it!" I hissed. My stomach twisted at the sight. Burn marks didn't happen on their own, not in a section like this. They meant tampering, sabotage. I pushed back the surge of anger that rose in my throat. This was supposed to be a maintenance job, not an investigation into who, or what, had been screwing with the station. I ran my gloved fingers over the mark. The metal felt rough, uneven, not like the smooth surface it should have been. Someone had been here before, messing with the hull, and they hadn't bothered to fix their mess. I bit back a curse and moved away from the wall, trying to focus. One thing at a time. I'd deal with the sabotage later. Right now, I had to make sure the station held together. I floated back to the center of the storage section, recalibrating the pressure sensor to scan for any additional leaks. It beeped, signaling normal levels, but I didn't trust it. I didn't trust anything in this damn station anymore. The sensation of isolation pressed down on me, the knowledge that I was alone out here with nothing but failing equipment and the creeping emptiness outside. I adjusted my helmet, feeling the sweat prickling at the back of my neck. It was the same every day, a routine that didn't end, didn't let me relax. Because space didn't care, it didn't forgive mistakes. I checked my suit's oxygen levels again. Fine. Everything was still within the acceptable range, but the burn mark nagged at me, a splinter in the back of my mind. If someone had been tampering with the station's hull, it meant there could be more damage. Hidden fractures waiting to split open and suck me out into the vacuum. I gritted my teeth and moved to the airlock. I'd have to check the entire outer section. No other choice. I keyed the control panel, feeling the vibration through my gloves as the airlock hissed open. A blast of cold hit me, the kind that made my skin crawl even through the suit's insulation. The outer section was darker than the rest of the station, its lights dimmed to conserve power. I stepped inside, my boots clanging dully on the metal floor. I could hear the faintest whistle of escaping pressure somewhere down the corridor. I squinted, trying to pinpoint the source, but the shadows swallowed up everything past a few meters. "All right," I muttered to myself, gripping the patch kit tighter. "Let's find this damn leak." I moved forward, careful not to disturb the mess on the floor. Broken panels, loose cables, scattered tools, the usual chaos of an outer section in disrepair. I waved the sensor back and forth, its steady beeping the only sound in the silence. The screen showed pressure fluctuations, but nothing concrete, nothing I could pinpoint. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes through the visor. This was turning into a nightmare. I'd seen leaks before, plenty of them, but this felt different. Like the station was deliberately resisting my efforts, hiding its wounds. I stopped. There, on the left wall, was another thin line of frost. I approached it cautiously, running the sensor over the area. The pressure was definitely dropping here, just as slowly as before. I peeled off another patch, slapping it onto the seam and pressing hard. The adhesive hissed, sealing the crack with a thin, glistening layer. I waited, counting the seconds. 10, 15, 30. The sensor beeped steadily, showing stable pressure. I exhaled slowly, relief mixed with a sour taste of dread. 2 leaks in one day. 2 leaks that looked a hell of a lot like sabotage. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone, at some point, had been messing with the station, and they'd done a damn good job of making sure it wouldn't be an easy fix. I straightened up, staring at the frost-covered patch. Questions tumbled through my mind, unbidden. Who had been here? Why? Was it some kind of sick joke, a way to test how far they could push the station's systems before it collapsed? I didn't have answers, and right now I didn't need them. All I needed was to keep this tin can from falling apart. I'd worry about the rest later. The next steps were painfully clear. I had to patch up the breach in the outer hull, and I had to do it fast. This wasn't like fixing a pipe back on Earth. Out here, you didn't get second chances. One mistake, one overlooked fracture, and the whole station could depressurize. I grabbed the repair kit, the heaviness of its contents pulling against my magnetic boots, and made my way towards the outer hatch. As I approached, my eyes caught on the metal bulkhead where I'd found the frost earlier. My hands worked automatically, setting up the portable welding gear I'd brought along, but my mind kept drifting back to the scorch marks. Someone had tampered with the station, and if that someone was still out there, I was in more danger than I cared to admit. Focus. I had to focus on fixing this leak, one problem at a time. I set the welding torch on the floor and keyed the access panel for the hatch leading to the outer compartment. The hatch groaned as it slid open, revealing the dimly lit space ahead. The temperature in here was lower. I could feel it through my suit's insulation. The pressure drop was apparent as I stepped inside, the station groaning under the strain. This compartment was close to the hull breach, and every step toward the far wall felt like walking into an icebox. The outer hull was a different beast altogether. The lights here were sparse, barely functioning. Equipment crates lined the walls, most strapped down, some floating at awkward angles due to the low gravity. I scanned the area, looking for the telltale signs of a breach. Frost, cracks, anything that didn't belong. There. Toward the far wall, a patch of frost spread outward from a narrow seam like a thin web. I pulled out the pressure sensor and held it up. It beeped steadily, confirming what I already knew. The breach was worse than I had hoped. The hull had fractured in multiple places, the frost obscuring the extent of the damage. I crouched down and set the sensor aside, feeling the tug of the suit's inner lining on my damp skin as I moved. The cold air inside the compartment clawed at my face through the visor, making it hard to concentrate. I fumbled with the sealant gel, my fingers stiff inside the gloves. It took longer than it should have to peel off the cap and squeeze out the thick, viscous substance. Come on, come on, I muttered under my breath, smearing the gel along the fractured seam. I spread it evenly, pushing it into the cracks with the flat edge of a scraping tool. The gel hardened almost instantly, sealing off the visible fractures, but it wasn't a permanent fix. Just a temporary patch to stop the immediate pressure loss. I pulled a patch from my kit, peeling back the adhesive layer and pressing it against the frosted surface. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself holding my breath as I applied pressure. The adhesive hissed, bonding with the metal, but something felt off. The patch wasn't sitting right. I pressed harder, feeling the cold seep into my gloves, but it wouldn't stick properly. Damn it! I spat, checking the pressure sensor. The numbers were still dropping, slower now, but still dropping. That meant there was more damage hidden beneath the frost, fractures running deeper into the hull. I didn't have enough gel or patches to cover an area this big. I could try welding the cracks shut, but that would involve clearing the frost first, and that would take time. Time I didn't have. The station's atmosphere was leaking out with every passing second. I needed a faster solution. I glanced around the compartment, eyes settling on the emergency thermal strips clamped to the wall. They were meant for insulation, to regulate temperature in critical sections of the station. Not exactly what they were designed for, but they could work as a temporary sealant if applied correctly. I grabbed the strips, the metallic surface freezing against my gloves as I carried them back to the breach. I peeled back the protective layer on the first strip and pressed it along the seam. The strip clung to the metal, forming a barrier over the fractured area. I worked quickly, unrolling another strip and overlapping it with the first. The pressure sensor beeped, signaling a slow but steady rise in the compartment's air pressure. It was working, at least for now. I stayed there, crouched by the breach, staring at the strips. My body ached from the tension, every muscle taut and coiled. I glanced at the pressure sensor again, watching the numbers stabilize just below nominal levels. A temporary victory, but not a real solution. The compartment was dead silent, with only the faint vibrations from the station breaking the stillness. I closed my eyes, trying to collect my thoughts. This was supposed to be a simple maintenance mission, routine repairs, and system checks. Now I was fighting to keep the station from falling apart, patching leaks that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And all the while, that burn mark kept creeping back into my mind. Sabotage. Someone had set this in motion long before I got here. I needed to get back to the main cabin and run a full diagnostic. There was no telling how many more fractures the hull might have, how many more leaks were waiting to spring open the moment I turned my back. I stepped away from the breach, casting one last glance at the patched-up seam. It would hold for now, but I wasn't fooling myself. This was just a stopgap, a bandage on a wound that went much deeper. I collected the sensor and my tools, stuffing them back into the kit. I needed to move, keep going, keep fixing. The station wasn't going to fix itself, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let it beat me. As I made my way back to the hatch, a thought surfaced, unbidden. If this was sabotage, then someone or something had planned it this way. The idea sent a chill down my spine, colder than the compartment around me. I pushed it down, shoved it deep into the back of my mind. One problem at a time. Fix the station first, figure out the rest later. The hatch opened and I stepped through, re-entering the main section. I approached the control panel and keyed in the diagnostic sequence. The screen activated, with lines of green and yellow code cascading rapidly. I watched, arms folded across my chest. It felt like an eternity before the readout stabilized. I scanned the data, my eyes narrowing. Pressure levels were holding, for now. Temperature was within operational limits. But then I spotted it, a warning indicator for structural integrity tucked into the lower left corner of the screen. Multiple points flagged in yellow. The outer hull had stress fractures in more places than I'd patched. I'd only found the tip of the iceberg. My gut twisted. This wasn't just a simple leak. This was the station's death knell. A chain reaction waiting to happen. If the fractures spread, and they would, given enough time, the whole structure could buckle under the pressure, ripping open like a can. I was about to start drafting a repair plan when something else caught my eye. The diagnostics log. There was an entry time-stamped from 3 days ago, a manual pressure override in a section of the station I hadn't been to in weeks. My hand froze over the keyboard. I scrolled back through the log, looking for anything out of place. There, another entry. This one from yesterday. Someone had accessed the station's maintenance database, running checks on the air scrubbers, seals, and environmental systems. The thought hit me like a blow to the chest. I was the only one supposed to be up here. I hadn't touched those systems in days. And yet, someone had been accessing them. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls tightening around me as I stared at the screen. I gripped the edge of the panel, my knuckles white inside the gloves. I was on borrowed time. Fixing the fractures would take more than patch kits and thermal strips. It would take welding, reinforcing the hull from the inside out. But now, I had a different problem. a problem that was still moving around inside this station. I stared at the screen, cold sweat soaking into the inner lining of my suit. The logs didn't make sense. System access, 3 days ago. Pressure override in the environmental section. It wasn't me. I hadn't been there in weeks. "Someone's here," I muttered under my breath. "Someone's been here the whole time." I pushed off the console and floated towards the storage bay, moving on instinct. My mind spun with questions. Who was it? How did they get in? The station's logs should have shown any incoming craft, but what if they tampered with that too? It made sense now. The burn marks, the leaks, the tampering. Someone had been setting traps for me, watching me scramble from one disaster to the next. And now they were hiding, waiting for me to make the next mistake. The storage bay came into view, dark and cluttered. I flipped on the lights, revealing a weak, yellow glow spilling over the rows of crates and tools secured to the walls. I scanned the room, eyes darting from corner to corner. No movement. I floated forward, my breathing loud in my helmet, the hiss of recycled air punctuating each inhale. I passed a stack of crates and froze. Something glinted in the corner, a small object wedged between a toolbox and a panel. I floated closer, reaching out with a gloved hand. My fingers brushed against it, and I pulled it free. It was a toy, a plastic astronaut, no more than 2 inches tall. It wore a suit that looked like mine right down to the patch on the chest, but its legs were missing, snapped off, leaving jagged plastic stumps. "What the hell?" My voice trailed off as I turned the toy over, examining it. Who would leave this here? Had I brought this up with me? No, impossible. I'd never seen it before. A chill crept down my spine, not from the station's failing temperature controls, but from the sheer wrongness of this discovery. I glanced around the bay, half expecting to see someone crouching behind the crates, watching me with a grin. Nothing. Just shadows and the cold silence of the station. I shoved the toy into a side pouch on my suit and moved on, my skin crawling beneath the layers of fabric. The whole place felt different now, tainted, like I was trespassing in a space that had once been mine. Focus, I told myself. I needed to find the source of the tampering. I checked my helmet display, pulling up the environmental system logs. They pointed me towards the rear maintenance corridor, where the environmental controls were housed. I floated forward, heading deeper into the station. The corridor was darker than the rest of the station. The overhead lights barely worked. I moved slowly, scanning the bulkheads for signs of damage. My breath fogged up the inside of the visor, clouding my view. I could hear my own heartbeat, a rapid drumbeat that wouldn't slow down. I stopped at a panel near the corridor's end, where the environmental controls were installed. The panel had been left slightly ajar, wires spilling out like exposed veins. Inside, the wiring was a mess. Someone had cut through the insulation, rerouting power to the pressure regulators. I examined the sabotage. This wasn't random damage, it was deliberate, calculated. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to hit, how to cripple the station's systems. I had to fix this, had to get the station back under control. I grabbed a multi-tool from my belt and set to work, stripping wires and reconnecting circuits with frantic motions. My hands moved automatically, twisting wires, adjusting pressure valves, trying to reset the environmental controls. Then I heard it, a soft, muffled laugh. I froze, the multi-tool slipping from my fingers. The sound came from the corridor, faint but unmistakable. I turned around, heart hammering. The corridor was empty, just as it had been moments ago. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing, just the hiss of air from the vents. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. No one else was here. There couldn't be. I was alone, had been alone for months. But then, what had I heard? I returned to the wiring, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the tool. What if someone was hiding, watching me, waiting for me to slip up? The toy, the laughter, the burn marks, it all pointed to one thing. I wasn't alone, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the corridor. In the darkness, something moved. My breath caught in my throat. There, crouched against the wall, was a figure. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. It was my old boss, wearing only the casual clothes I remembered from our last meeting on Earth. He was staring at the wiring panel, his hands working at something I couldn't see. "What are you doing?" I croaked, stepping forward. The figure didn't react, just kept tinkering with the wires, a faint smile playing on his lips. I moved closer, my feet clanking heavily on the floor, and reached out. The lights wavered, and suddenly, he was gone. My hand grasped empty air. I staggered back, looking around wildly. Nothing. The corridor was empty, just as it had been before. My breathing turned ragged, my chest tight with panic. I stumbled back to the panel, staring at the mess of wires. "Not real," I whispered to myself. "It wasn't real." But the damage was. The wires were still cut, the system still malfunctioning. I needed to finish the repairs, needed to hold the station together. I forced myself to work, reconnecting circuits, sealing off the damaged panel with a scrap of metal. As I finished, I looked down and felt my stomach twist into a knot. Lying on the floor, right where the figure had crouched, was a pair of gloves. My gloves. At least they looked like mine, the exact same design with the small tear along the left thumb that I had patched up just last week. But they were stained. A dark, sticky substance coated the fingertips, a reddish brown that stood out starkly against the station's greys. It looked like blood, but thicker, almost congealed. I bent down and picked them up. The material was clammy, like they had been submerged in something. I hadn't left these here. I never took off my gloves while working. So how? I turned them over, and my heart skipped a beat. There was something inside wedged into the fingers. I squeezed the palm of the glove, feeling the stiff, unyielding shapes. Slowly I tipped them over, letting the contents slide out. Teeth. Human teeth, speckled with dried blood. They drifted out of the gloves, floating in the air in front of me like a morbid constellation. A mix of molars and canines, some broken, others intact. They bobbed slowly, glistening in the dim light, each one spinning lazily in the weightlessness of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I forgot to exhale. I stumbled back, my magnetic boots clamping down awkwardly on the metal floor as I shoved myself away from the hovering teeth. They floated there, suspended between me and the bulkhead like they were watching. I forced my eyes away, scanning the corridor. No, this couldn't be happening. I was alone. I had to be alone. But the teeth, they said otherwise. I shoved the gloves into the pouch with the toy astronaut, bile burning at the back of my throat. This wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. It felt like the station was turning inside out, folding over itself to spit out pieces of my own mind. I had to keep moving, keep fixing. There was no time to stop and think, no time to process the madness creeping into every corner of this place. I moved back toward the main cabin, my steps unsteady. As I floated through the corridors, I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eyes. Shadows flitting along the walls, figures ducking out of sight. I turned around, scanning the dark passages, but found nothing. I pushed into the main cabin and stopped dead. Standing by the control panel was my wife. She looked exactly as I remembered. Dark hair tied back, wearing the old sweatshirt she used to sleep in. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't place. "Why are you here?" I choked out, stepping forward. "How did you get here?" She didn't respond, just stared at me with that look. Pity, horror, confusion, all mixed into one. I took another step, reaching out, and then she was gone. I blinked, gasping for air as I stumbled to the control panel. I pulled up the diagnostics, my mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. I needed to focus. I needed to fix the station. But it was as if the station itself refused to be fixed. The controls let out sharp beeps, the lights dimmed to a soft glow, and from within the vents, a distant laugh seemed to taunt me. I pushed off the wall, kicking into the corridor. The teeth floated behind me, drifting aimlessly like they were searching for a place to settle. I couldn't look at them anymore. I had to get back to the console. Run another diagnostic. Fix something. The station creaked around me, the sound of metal warping under pressure. My suit was slick with sweat, sticking to my skin in all the wrong places. My eyes darted left and right, catching movement in the corridors. My own distorted reflection skittered across the polished metal panels, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. I reached the main cabin and pulled myself inside. The lights blinked dimly, casting the control panels in a yellow glow. I yanked myself towards the console, my hands fumbling over the switches as I brought the systems online. Pressure levels were erratic. Temperature controls had failed in at least 2 sections. And there, blinking in crimson at the edge of the display, was the most damning warning. Structural integrity compromised. Multiple breaches detected. "Shut up," I muttered, my voice ragged. I hammered on the keys, trying to isolate the breaches, route power to the pressure regulators. Nothing worked. Every time I patched one problem, another sprang up, like the station was tearing apart from the inside. A clatter sounded behind me. I turned around, heart pounding. Floating by the airlock was a toolbox, its lid open, tools drifting out like the innards of a gutted animal. But it wasn't just tools. Sticking out from among the wrenches and screwdrivers was something that made my blood turn to ice. A piece of fabric, torn and bloodied, patterned with stripes I recognized all too well. My wife's favorite shirt. I pushed off the console, drifting closer to the toolbox. My hands shook as I reached out, fingers grazing the fabric. It spun slowly in the zero gravity, trailing droplets of something dark. Not quite blood, more like oil mixed with something else. It left a smear on my gloves that glistened under the dim light. No, I breathed, shaking my head. "You're not here. You can't be here." I turned back to the console, gripping the edge of the panel so hard, my knuckles ached. I had to keep going. I couldn't let the station fall apart. I started pulling up schematics, my eyes scanning for the source of the breaches. But the lines on the screen blurred, twisting into spirals and jagged shapes. I blinked hard, trying to focus, when suddenly there was movement in the corner of my eye. I jerked my head around and froze. It was me. Standing in the doorway, wearing the same suit, staring at me with empty black eyes. The visor reflected nothing, just darkness. It raised a gloved hand and pointed slowly to the console. I looked down at the console. The screen had changed. It showed a new log entry. Manual pressure override. Section 4A. Time-stamped right now. My blood ran cold. I hadn't touched that section in days. How? I turned back, but the figure in the doorway was gone. Just the empty corridor stretching out into darkness. I had to fix it. I had to stop the override. My fingers moved across the keys, trying to seal off the section, reroute pressure to the remaining compartments. The cabin lights dimmed, followed by a low hiss that stirred a cold wave of dread through my veins. The room seemed to tilt around me, walls closing in, squeezing my chest. My helmet display flashed warnings, oxygen levels critical, pressure dropping. The taste of metal filled my mouth, thick and sour. "No," I growled, slamming my fist against the console. "I won't let you win." I ripped open a side panel, exposing a tangle of wires. My hands moved frantically, pulling at cables, trying to force a manual reset. I yanked at the wiring, sparks flying as I forced connections back into place. The station's steady drone returned, and the pressure indicators settled back to safe levels. A laugh echoed through the cabin. I froze. The laugh was soft, mocking, coming from everywhere at once. I turned around, eyes wide. In the shadows by the control panel stood another figure. It was my mother. She was dressed in the old, faded sweater she used to wear around the house. Her face was hollow, eyes too wide, staring at me with a look of pity that twisted into something more sinister. Slowly, she lifted a finger, pointing past me to the airlock. Her mouth curled into a grim, unnatural smile, revealing teeth that didn't belong there. Sharp, more like shards of glass than anything human. "No," I choked out. "You're not real." She didn't respond, just stood there with that awful smile. I turned away, dreading what I would see, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. The airlock door was wide open, and beyond it floated something that made my skin crawl. A body, my body, face down, drifting in the zero-gravity darkness, motionless. The back of the suit was torn open and dark droplets leaked out, freezing instantly in the cabin's cold. I screamed, shoving myself back, crashing into the console. My hands fumbled for the controls, slamming buttons, trying to seal the airlock, close off the section. But nothing happened. The door stayed open, the bloodied body drifting closer, its head lolling with each shift in the air currents. My helmet display flashed a warning. Suit oxygen reserves critical. My chest tightened. The station's oxygen was nearly gone, and my suit had been running on emergency reserves. I was suffocating right alongside this dying metal coffin. The cabin lights dimmed again, leaving me in near darkness. I gasped for air, feeling the room spin. My mind teetered on the edge, clawing for something real to hold on to. But all I had were ghosts that wore familiar faces. The cabin lights dimmed one last time, then went dark. The drone of the station died, leaving only the hiss of escaping air. I gasped, feeling the pressure in the room plummet. My helmet display flashed red. Oxygen depleted. I pushed off the console, floating toward the emergency seal. My movements were sluggish, my limbs heavy. My vision tunneled, narrowing to a pinpoint as I reached out, groping for the latch. The cabin tilted around me, the darkness swirling, twisting into shapes I couldn't understand. I grabbed the latch, yanking it down with the last of my strength. The emergency seal slid into place, blocking off the airlock. But it was too late. I could feel the air thinning, every breath a struggle. The suit clung to my skin, cold and damp, squeezing me like a vice. I turned around, back toward the console. The screen flashed weakly, showing the final status. Total systems failure. Life support offline. In the reflection of the screen, I saw them. All of them. My wife, my boss, my own reflection. They stood in a line, staring at me with empty eyes, silent and still. I tried to speak, to shout, but no sound came. My vision blurred, spots of darkness spreading across my sight. I drifted in place, my hands slipping off the console. The station creaked one last time, the walls buckling inward, metal groaning in a final protest. The figures before me faded into the darkness, leaving me alone in the failing light. The air grew icy, biting into my skin, squeezing my chest until every breath was a battle. My heartbeat slowed, each pulse echoing in the silence. I closed my eyes, the station spinning around me, the last of the oxygen slipping away. Somewhere deep in the void, I heard the laugh again, faint and mocking. The station shuddered, the final breath of metal giving way to the infinite cold outside.